having a child is about as close as you can come to creating a universe. I mean, if God created the universe ex nihilo, about the closest thing we could come to participating using that communicable attribute of creativity is creating another human being. And I think at the end of the day, what's really been lost here is we don't understand what we're actually creating when we produce a child. All right, everyone. Welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jacob Daniel.
Hi there.
And Vice President of the Kirkwood Center, Lenny Esposito. Gentlemen, how are you doing today? Everybody good?
So far, so good. Although I'm a little disturbed by the topic that we're going to talk about for a couple of reasons. And it should be something that I think concerns people more than they realize.
Yeah, and it touches on so many different aspects of our life.
You know, I hate to say it, but it does seem like most of the topics we discuss are concerning. Are concerning and
we should be bringing up things that are important,
yeah.
Right?
But you know, we're going to be looking at the issue of marriage, and especially marriage and children, the having of children, the having and raising of children, and the kind of contemporary view, or some contemporary views on whether or not people should be having children. Something that probably was taken for granted in most of human history. Maybe, maybe this is not as novel as we often think. But, one of the things that we've been tracking is the rise of what some people have called anti-natalism, or just child-free marriage or child-free partnerships, and a lot of the people who maybe are anti-natalists or have a disposition against having children are also maybe not, in traditional marriages as well. And one of an article we're going to look at today was, and I'll pull it up here. It was a good article in the sense it was very interesting, very well written. Although I tell you, it really highlights. So the article is by Rachel Cohen. It's in Vox, and the title is "How Millennials Learn to Dread Motherhood." And Lenny, I'll start with you. But one of the things that I would say right off the bat, having read this article, which again is very interesting, very well written, but it really, if anything, it shows like how incredibly different, like, a world we're living in, when we read something about marriage, family, and children by a non-Christian, right? By and even a non-theist, probably an atheist. Given, and it's like the cultural assumptions are less and less Christian than ever before in our country's history. And I'm reading this and I'm like, wow, not only it's just a world apart from how I, as a Bible believing Christian, think about marriage and family. It's just so different. So that was just one of my first impressions. I mean, that's why it's almost like fascinating to read this, about how people are wrestling with ideas about children, about whether or not they should have children.
Well, yeah. So Rachel Cohen is a senior reporter for Vox. She's reporting on these kinds of issues, covering social policy, housing, schools, things like this. I don't know what her belief system is. She's probably I mean, she does lean left. We know that. Could be a nun. But to back up a little bit, there's a few things in this article. And what's interesting, there was an article in The Guardian a couple of years ago, actually June of 2020, who was written by Sian, Cain, smaller version of the saying. I think Rachel Cohen's got about maybe 2,500 words. Sian, Cain is maybe about 1,000. But they're both senior reporters, and they're both tackling about why a generation is choosing to be child free. And the subtitle for Rachel Cohen's article is "To Our Generation, How Millennials Learn to Dread Motherhood" is the title. And it says, "To our generation, being a mom looks thankless, exhausting, and lonely." And that's by itself something that's highly telling. And she does point to the different surveys that millennials have taken and how they're explaining this away. And she also notes, fairly enough, that the women with the most financial resources and the highest levels of education are the ones who report the most stress and unhappiness with motherhood. So you see all of that. So there's a couple of things I think that are going on here. First of all, it is clear that in most of the Western societies, birth rates are declining significantly. And in general, we have to say what's going on with our society. But the millennials have actually pushed this to a new level. And what they've done is they've worried about a couple of different things. One that they always point to is the exhaustion, the taxing, the amount of personal commitment it's going to take in order to bring these other people into the world, rear them. I mean, it's 18 years, 20 years, right? 25 years, depending on how many children you have, that you have to dedicate your life in service of another, in service of the next generation. It's not even like marriage anymore, where marriage is, well, if it doesn't work out, we get a divorce, no big deal. So there's a fact that they have to realize that this is a relationship that I cannot escape from. I think that's telling. And I think it says as much about their understanding of marriage and coupling as it does about their understanding of children as being part of the family. So there's that aspect. There's also the aspect of can we afford it? Will I be able to express myself and my individuality? What about my work? It's so hard, and over we hear, it's so hard to re-enter the workforce once you've taken time off in order to rear a family. You know, it's tough in your 30s or 40s to get back in there again and make your mark on society. So note that they're using a yardstick that's based on economic success, that's based on the success
Social
and understanding of their peers,
right?
and instead of what their nuclear family is. And then thirdly, the environment is always thrown into the mix as a kind of a get out of jail free card. A kind of, well, you know, we know that the environment's crashing and the world is going to be, how can we bring children into such a world? How, and with all the misery and the suffering that's going on in the world, how can you justify a generation who in 10 years, scientists are telling us that, you know, climate change will be such that it would be inescapable for them. And you hear these kinds of thoughts echoed. So here's the three pieces that she's stating over and over again. And to me, I think that it's telling on several levels. The first piece, we've talked in the past about the idea of disenchantment, that we see the world in materialistic means, we don't see God. Well, if you don't see God, then it's no surprise that you think that the world is going to crash in 10 years. But if there's a God in his heaven, maybe that's not true. Now, that's not true for a whole lot of other reasons as well. If you look at it longitudinally by any objective standard, we are sitting at the best point in history. The standard of living for even those in developing nations is higher than it's ever been. The levels of poverty are dropping. The amount of food that people are getting are rising. The amount of violence that the world over, in a general sense, is falling. I can point to the book Progress by Johan Nordberg. Steven Pinker has done work on this. There's all kinds of stats when you look at it over the past 200 years, even the past 50 years, that shows that no, it's actually better now than it's ever been before. So, but if you don't believe that there's a God, of course not. Of course, but here's something else, and I'm just going to take a basic economic principle, and this is really what concerns me the most. Basic economics says that you always seek to get more of the thing you value most. If you value money, you grab a lot of money. If you see gold, you want to get a lot of gold. Here we see people not valuing other people. They value themselves, but they don't value the humanity of children and of the next generation. At least they don't value it enough to claim some of it for themselves. They don't value family. And that's where the breakdown is. Our hyper-individualistic society is actually turning people against humanity. And that's scary.
Well, boy, I mean that's those are some good points. One of the okay, so there again, there were the two articles, one by Cohen, which was the longer one in Vox, and then the one in the Guardian by what was her name, Sian,
Sian Cain.
Cain.
Sian.
And reading those both of those together, and this is a good exercise for Christians who are looking at culture, at culture and trying to do apologetics, understand, because again, they're coming at this from just without any theistic or Christian theistic resources at all. They're coming at this like huge question of the procreation of children and the meaning of marriage and bearing and raising of children without any sort of Christian framework, Judeo-Christian framework at all.
That's right.
Family has trying to figure it out. I mean, to Cohen's credit, I mean, she's trying to, like, you see some genuine wrestling here. Like, what are we supposed to do? One of the things that struck me then at the level of sort of just like historical, where we are in history is, with this sort of like totally secularized sort of framework, all you can do is compare societies historically. I mean, there's no transcendent, there's no revelation, there's no transcendent standard or to evaluate this any answers by, right, that you might give for whether or not it's good or right or pure or to have children. You just have to look either at history and what other cultures have done or what other people in your own culture are doing, and then just try and figure it out. Right? That's all you have.
And you have no you have no other value system against which, so even if you look and see what other people are doing, you could just say, oh, that's wrong. You can just say, pull a number out of a hat like that. Oh, I think the earth can only support 1.8 billion people comfortably, and therefore we've got to try and depopulate.
So we're still, I mean, the framework there is entirely one of cultural or individual relativism. Relative to what? Relative to what some other people have done. And then trying to see if you have an intuitive inclination towards that or against it, which then so and within that is still the overarching idea that the only real telos here for human beings is to maximize personal pleasure or personal happiness through the avoidance of pain and the increase of pleasure. So you go back, we're still living sort of in Bentham and Mill's world, in that Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham was Mill's godfather, by the way. I don't know if you guys knew that. But we're still living just in this matrix of a sort of utilitarian ethic where I'm living here and I need to figure out what is going to maximize my personal happiness. And that's going to be usually wind up on a pleasure pain sort of matrix. Now, again, to Cohen's credit, she does start to push into more like things about, deeper meaning and purpose, though. Where she's saying, yeah, but there are a lot of reports about women who are living more traditional lives, although the way she describes these trad wives, it's not what I would consider actually traditional, and they report being very happy. And she does get a little bit more into the idea of like deeper things like, interpersonal connection and the need to sort of have a greater sense of responsibility. But she also seems very nervous about going back to anything that might.
She claims that she's too worried that some of those people are somehow propagandists. They're play acting. That's one of the things that she said. I can't believe anything I see on Instagram about these happy women because it just seems too phony to me. And okay, I get that. There's a lot of phony on Instagram and social media, Facebook, what have you, but that doesn't mean that they're intentionally trying to usurp you or lie to you with this thing. Matter of fact, what we're finding is even in countries like Sweden, where they're the most egalitarian societies, the women tend to fall into the role that is most kind of normalized for females. It's common, and what happens is many women have reported that they plan on being a career woman. Well, have a kid, I'll do the nanny thing, and then after the child shows up, all of a sudden their priorities and their motivations change, and they find out, I actually do want to be home with my child. I actually do. It actually is better, and it surprises them, and I think it would surprise her as well.
And I think that's the very basic nature by which we were designed to live by. And I think what wisdom calls people on either side, natalism or anti-natalism, we are in the realm of morality. The questions are moral questions. So we should be asking us to what's grounding those moral questions, even with regards to future. One of the arguments with anti-natalism is that there is so much of evil. How can you actually bring another being into this world? It's a moral question. So I think they are very covenantal in that regard, that they recognize the sin of yet to be born people, right? And want to avert that without recognizing their own personal sins that they are not recognizing. And I think that's where the danger is. And I also wonder if with anti-natalism, if it's this final stretch of a social experiment of getting away from all basic institutions and fundamentally basic nature. So with the new trends that are coming up with traditional wives and traditional women, trad women, I think there is a possibility of return. People are recognizing, as you were saying, Lenny, right? In the Scandinavian nations, for example, if you allow for freedom and for those basic natures to work out, it would always go back to the basic frame in which we were built. And I think that's necessary. And whenever that's curtailed,
as much as you try and bend and break it. So Jacob, guys, so here was reading the two articles. I noticed three basic reasons that were given by both authors. You mentioned a couple. One is concerns about the environment, meaning the nature, the environmental crisis, and this was especially in the Guardian article.
Yeah, I have. Matter of fact, I have it here. Let me read an excerpt. It says, she writes, "Sometimes I suddenly want a daughter with the same staggering intensity my father felt when he first cradled my tiny body in his big hands. I want to feel that reassuring weight, a reminder of the persistence of life. Then I remember the numbers. If my baby were to be born today, he'd be 10 years old when a quarter of the world's insects would be gone. 100 million children are expected to be suffering extreme food scarcity, and my child would be 23 when 99% of the coral reefs are set to experience severe bleaching. And they would be 30 when 200 million climate refugees would be roaming the world. Half of all the species of Earth are predicted to be extinct, and they'd be 80 when parts of Australia, Africa, and the United States could be uninhabitable.
So this is a fear-based consideration about making the decision to have children. You're basing your decision on a fear, which, one would ask the question of whether or not that's the right basis for making decisions. Sometimes it can be. In that the second kind of fear that I think so I noticed there were two basically fear-based reasons given. One was this specifically environment, which is part of the bigger question of bringing a child into what we would call the problem of evil and suffering. And that would be one example of evil and suffering. The other would be, people, oh, there's so much crime in the world, human evil, right? I don't want to bring a child into a world riddled with crime and war and, deviancy and everything. That's, Jacob, like what you said, the potential parent is fearful of what their child might have to endure at the hands of others. Yet, of course, at the same time, is not looking at themselves as part of that human problem necessarily, right? So those are the two what I call fear-based reasons that were given. Which again, what is interesting is it's all just potential fear, right? So you're giving into something that's not real or not yet real, and you're allowing that to make the decision on whether or not you should do something that, at least in Cohen's article, is sort of said, she grants it's very meaningful, something that's potentially deeply meaningful. So what I noticed in both articles, the authors really seem driven by by fear and anxiety, right? I mean, fear and anxiety is motivating these
And what
decisions or
justifies,
these.
and Lenny, as you mentioned, what justifies that a future is only bleak? With regards to what we've seen, if you go more on the scientific way and on the way of what the statistics tells us, we live in a world that you want to live in.
Let
this
me give you a really hard,
100 years back, right?
Concrete example. In 1974, 50 years ago, there was an episode of All in the Family, which was written by Norman Lear. He was a left of center guy. Norman Lear just died, by the way, and so that's why this print. And they were Gloria and Mike, which was the young couple, which was usually Norman Lear's mouthpiece. Mike Stivic was the left of center guy. Archie Bunker was the right wing bigot. That's how the show is portrayed. They were arguing because he says he didn't want to bring children into the world. This is 1974. There are nearly 4 billion people on this planet, he says in 1974. In 10 years, we don't have enough food to feed them all when they become 5.8. He said, there are gases in our hairsprays, right, that are going to eat through the ozone layer. And how are we going to, grow crops when that happens? And how can we justify bringing a child into this world with it was exactly the same fears. Yet this generation of writers were born after that objection. And we have basically about double the number of people on Earth now that we had in 1975. And again, through objective standards, everybody's living a better life. So the claims haven't changed, but the facts show that they're not grounded in reality.
Well, so with regards to the environmental concern that's given, there is a question there whether or not those are really based in fact.
Yeah, we've heard the hockey
whether or
stick.
not those fears are just warranted at all, given the actual facts or not. And maybe we can't totally know that, but again, there's a hopelessness that there's sort of a default to it must be the worst case scenario. Um, because the other thing, because that might be sort of novel today, but I guarantee you 2,000-3,000 years ago, you read Greek and Roman history, there were people um not who didn't want to bring children in the world because of the other aspect of the problem of evil and suffering, because they just saw the world as a cruel world. So I don't think that's new. I don't think that's novel. I mean, we got plenty of ancient poets who would say, the best thing is for man never to be born, and the second best thing is to die quickly. So that's an ancient sentiment. We can find that in many of the poets. And that's usually just because life is seen as cruel and short. Of course, that's a pagan mindset, of course. So I think we're living in a pagan world. These authors are working off of this. I'm reading through Chesterton right now, Orthodoxy, and Chesterton just had this wonder at the miracle of the world. The miraculous world that we live in. So there's just this generic kind of pagan view of the world as just a cruel, pitiless place that is either going to die out soon anyways, or even if it continues on, it's just
It's
people
no
are evil. Why would we bring children into
Yeah,
it?
it's no surprise that lack of belief and disenchantment leads to materialism, but that then leads to nihilism. And this is what Nietzsche fell into, and everybody. I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about a nihilist philosophy where the whole world is dark and brutish and short.
Yeah, definitely a return of paganism and also Eastern worldview. The idea of nothingness, and that can be achieved by losing your life, not by flourishing your life. And I think also we need to understand that this epidemic of pessimism is the characteristics of cults. And in the past, especially in the Western world, we have seen it only leads to collective death. The focus is not life. The focus is not flourishing. The focus is not developing and growing and making things better. It's just ending things as they are. And I think that's where we need to be careful. And I think there's a huge shift when it comes to when we talk about marriage and procreation. In one sense, it's the end of sex as we understood it, right? Marriage was the institution within which sex was meant for procreation, the very basic institution and nature that God established. And it's an attack on that. And I always say marriage as an institution is an institution of giving. You're always giving. The focus is the other. It's a sacrificial responsibility towards the other. Whereas we have shifted that, the whole framework is shifted into getting as to what you can. The focus is your own self. And I think pleasure plays a major role in this as well. We can't deny that while people do hide under this pietistic view of, or a moral view of, they want to preserve the world as it is. But I think it comes down to, we can't deny the fact that people are self-centered and they want to live their life to the fullest as they want it.
And that was certainly the other strain. So if one sort of set of reasons was fear, just I'm afraid to have children because of it's a cruel world, or the world is going to come to an end by the time they're older, it's going to be awful for them. The other is, this is just going to get in the way of my hedonistic exploits. And that that's not just having casual sex, that's all my social climbing, my feeling of fulfillment in the work that I do. I mean, some of those things are obviously not, it's not that they're bad in themselves. It's not bad to want to have a successful career, to apply your talents in certain areas of society. But clearly what came out in both articles was children are a burden. They get in the way of these other pursuits. And the sacrifice just isn't worth it. Right? It's just not worth it. My other pursuits are just more important than even the deep connection And one thing, I'm going to read a quote. Let me read a quote here from the Cohen article. That I think one or two that sums it up. She says, this is from Cohen's article on the dread of motherhood. Quote, I know some women who have decided to forego motherhood altogether, not out of an empowered certainty that they want to remain child-free, but because the alternative seems impossibly daunting. Others are still choosing motherhood, but with profound apprehension that it will require them to sacrifice everything that brings them pleasure. End quote. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. I'm just working on a pleasure pain matrix. What's going to bring me more pleasure? What's going to bring me more pain? And that's kind of the end of the decision making process. So again, it's very utilitarian.
Yeah, the problem is they undercut themselves, and here's why they don't realize this from a utilitarian perspective. At least guys like Bentham and Mill would think more long term than maybe the next 5 minutes. Once you hit 60 or 65 in any society, you have a generation, and we're seeing this with the baby boomers right now, where the baby boomers have aged. They're now aging out of jobs. Some of them can't do so. They have to be the greeter at Walmart or what have you, because they need the income in order to help support some of their medical necessities. But once you don't have a replacement generation that's contributing into the economy to help support whose taxes, whose benefits, whose insurance and all of that helps support the elder generation will inevitably suffer because there's simply not enough money to go around. There won't be enough doctors available. There won't be enough hospitals available. There won't be enough insurance available. From even a utilitarian standpoint, see, ancient cultures knew this. They knew that we need children, if for no other reason than we need a standing, strong army to protect us against the Vandals and the invaders and whomever. So that requires people to be replaced continuously. Now we don't need an army. We're so smart. We have all of our technology. But what we're finding out is the economy is just going to fall through the floor if there's nobody there working and everybody's on Medi-Cal or Medicare or something.
The one thing that did not come out at all in either article, and this is, you don't need to be a Christian or a theist to think this way, is there a moral obligation to the society to have children? And that just wasn't even touched. I mean, the 18th and 19th century utilitarians, they said they still would have been thinking in those terms. Hume wrote on this. Hume was before Mill and contemporary with Bentham, but he wrote on the necessity of children and healthy families for the sake of the social good. And Hume was clearly, he was an atheist. He might have wrote, occasionally hear about God or ever, but he didn't really believe in God. But even they it's like, but now that's not even a consideration, that maybe we should have children because it's going to benefit not only us, but it's going to be a benefit to the culture we're living in, to the society we're living in.
Yeah. And Tony, I would say that being an optimist, I tend to see the good that we can redeem out of all this. I wonder if we can redirect this sentiment of anti-consumerism, because I think a lot of young people that I talk to, they hold to the idea that the Western world is so much consumeristic in the sense that they're individualistic as well as consumeristic. So they are creating more waste, they're affecting the environment and everything. So in one sense, we can redirect that sentiment to the idea as to how could we be faithful consumers. At the same time, the emphasis is on giving as well. But another thing that I want to touch on is that I wonder if the whole idea of depressive realism is taking over the culture. The idea is that those who are depressive and have negative view about the culture and have lived experiences about it have the truth with them. So everyone else has to accommodate to their truth. So I think that's a dangerous idea. We should be moving the other side, actually, right?
C.S. Lewis wrote about that he's got one of the ghosts, I think, in The Great Divorce, who is that ghost. It's the depressive realist he talks about it in Screw Tape as well. Get them to think that whenever men talk about the worst of life, that's the true stuff, and that when people talk about the best or the wonder of life, that's all myth and fantasy and fairy tale. And it can't be true. The depressive realist. Yeah, that's right. This is how these articles do read, that life is only sort of genuine and authentic if it's just depressing and taxing. Joy. Now again, to Cohen's credit, she does bring in some other authors and voices and reference them. And there was one woman she referenced by the name of Jennifer Senior, who wrote a book called All Joy and No Fun, who is defending having children in spite of the difficulties that raising children that it comes with, and that hence the title of the book, All Joy, No Fun. There's joy there to be had. So, but yeah, you're right.
But no fun. I mean,
well,
even there,
that's not
it's
actually
like,
the case
oh, you're
either.
so brave, you had children.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, we have a lot of fun with our kids, both their mother and I. So that's not that's not a super accurate title either. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is this mood out there that it's only genuine, real, authentic if it kind of basically if it sucks, right?
And also, this is a symptom of our culture. We desire premature babies, if I may put it that way. We don't want to enter into a process. So with regards to anything good in culture that we see, it comes through process. It takes time. You build a nation through process, right? You don't build a nation in a day. You don't build a family in a day. You don't build church in a day. So I think there's an aversion to getting into a process which requires commitment. And I think our generation, especially the millennial generation, has not been trained in that manner, that the commitments can be good. It's required to create a flourishing society.
Well, and I think that's one of the unintended consequences of consumerism. We get so many of our necessities of life so easily that the idea that we would have to go through a long extended process in order to attain a good thing, is like foreign to us now. I mean, we get our meals fast. We can get, fast food, DoorDash. We get all these basic necessities that, we can get enough toys for our kids at Christmas, more than they need. So, and I'm not speaking about everybody, obviously we still have poverty and homelessness in the country, but we're, like Lenny said at the beginning, we're living in a time and a place where it's like, this is the best and easiest time to have children. In fact, to have multiple children.
As a matter of fact, the top health problem for those living under the poverty line in the United States is obesity. So that's an issue. But let me tell you something else that was interesting. I mentioned the All in the Family episode. It was season 5, episode 3, if anyone's interested in referencing it. In season 6, in the very next season, they decided to write in the fact that Gloria was pregnant. And of course, the fight ensued, and how are we going to do this and things like that. But interesting to their credit, the thing that they ended with was a quote by Alistair Cook. And this was a fascinating quote. And it reads like this. He says, this is Alistair Cook's writing. In the best of times, our days are numbered anyway. So it would be a crime against nature for any generation to take the world crisis so solemnly that it put off enjoying those things for which we were designed in the first place. The opportunity to do good work, to enjoy friends, to fall in love, to hit a ball, and to bounce a baby. And that was basically the end piece. And he's absolutely right. This is the old phrase, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. I mean, that's the opposite side of the coin. When you're talking about human flourishing, this is what makes humanity flourish. And again, we want to be more human. We want to endow ourselves and immerse ourselves in the transcendental virtues, in goodness and truth and beauty. And even if we live a short life, Blaise Pascal died relatively young, but look what he produced. Look at the amazing amount of things that humanity benefited just from him being on the earth. And some small children, the state of Texas right now, Texas Supreme Court, right, barred a woman from getting an abortion because she wanted to abort her child at 20 weeks who has trisomy 18, which is a genetic defect. And all of the newspaper articles say this is almost always fatal. Well, it turns out, no, that's not true, because there's a whole lot of kids. Matter of fact, 90% of the people who are born with trisomy 18 gene defect with proper medical care survive it well. It doesn't mean that they're going to live a normal life all the way through, just like Down syndrome children won't live a normal life, but that doesn't mean that they're not invaluable. They're valuable because they're human, all right? There's an intrinsic worth. But like I said, we are only collecting what we actually value. We tend to grab the things that we value. And it seems to me that there is a secular generation that doesn't value humanity and human relationships. They value individual fun. But by doing so, they don't realize what they're setting themselves up for when they get old and gray, and there's nobody to visit them at the old folks' home anymore.
Yeah, and I think the church needs to be careful as well, because we're breathing the same air. And I wonder, when I talk to young people within the church, they have the same sentiments and they're thinking the same way with regards to what lies in future. And sad to say, I mean, there's too much of the epidemic of pessimism, as I call it, even within the church too. We don't see future. We don't build for the next 500 years, right? We have this the whole idea of, I mean, it's very much eschatological in nature, but we have confidence that there is a resurrection after cross. That's what our gospel is about, and I think we are not preaching that. It has become so negative and so pessimistic that we are not caring for the generations and not wanting to leave a heritage that we all are called to.
I want to go deeper into this, get more specific with how this cultural movement is affecting the church, because I wrote a series of articles on whether or not evangelicals should have children. Well, I didn't have a serious question about that, but I titled it that way. But Lenny, because we touched on this deeper spiritual issue of not seeing human beings and the relationships that we have with them as intrinsically valuable, and therefore we're not pursuing them. Right there's we'll link this video. There's an incredible video that a young couple taped. It's called 99 Days. I'll find it and we'll link to it, where they gave birth to a son, can't remember his name, who they knew had almost no chance of surviving past, very long outside the womb. And he lived 99 days. And, you got that just, here's the thing. And now I'm going to encourage everybody to watch that video, because that's going to contrast with what Cohen writes here. Let me read this quote from Cohen's article. Again, where it's all about what, talk about consumerism. It's more like we're treating people like products. Lenny, we've done videos on this before.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, this plays into the video that we did where they're going to outsource pregnancy, if you remember right. I don't want to be same idea. So
here's something that Cohen writes about her boyfriend, her partner. Of course they're not married and fine. She said, quote, "As I let the conversation with my boyfriend simmer about having children, I imagined raising a child together and felt surprised by how nice the thought felt. Though I still worried that I lacked a maternal instinct, I was overcome with a warm certainty that my partner would make a great dad. Starting a family also seemed intriguing amid the post-pandemic recognition that a devotion to work is not what our short lives are all about," end quote. Now, there's a certain sentiment there that's correct. Our lives can't just be about work. They do have to be about something more. other people, children, right? But what I noticed there was she has this sense that her partner would be a great dad. Okay. And what's interesting is that's still about him though. That's still about like if I'm about me. Like this is something that I'll do, and in doing it I'll feel good about myself. Like I'll be able to apply my talents and skills to this. And that's sort of right. I mean, but I think what is missed here is that how children they don't fulfill us in the way we when we do a job and we do a job well and we get accolades for doing a good job and a promotion. There's a deeper change that occurs in being a parent. Lorianne Paul, who's a famous philosopher, she spoke at Biola a couple years ago. And I don't think she's a believer. She's not a believer or anything, but she talked about things that create radical changes in us, and that where we cannot prepare for them rationally before we just do them, right? One of which is like having children. You cannot go to your friends and tell me what it was like and try and figure out like rationally, on a purely rational calculation, whether or not it's the right thing to do or the rational thing to do. You just sort of have to do it. But in becoming a parent, it just changes you radically, right? So and one of the things that we probably should grant to these people, young people who are concerned about having, is we have to say, look, there is a sense where you cannot prepare for this. This is a step of faith. This is a step of faith in becoming a parent. It's the same thing with entering into marriage.
And this is no different from entering into marriage.
It's a leap of faith.
Right?
Yeah.
Because and ultimately it's all about covenant. It's about covenant relationship. And I think that's what we are missing in our culture. We enter into contract and we want to make contract with each other, and that's self-directed and for self-fulfillment. Whereas covenant demands sacrifice. And I think we are not committed to do that.
It's not about maybe I have the talents and skills to be a great dad, because this is what people do, I think. I've met people like unfortunately, I've met people like this in the church. They'll say things like, well, my wife and I, we just didn't feel like we would be good parents, therefore. And I'm like, that's not a good reason not to have children. This isn't about what skills or talents you have to do X, Y, or Z, anything really. This is about whether or not you're going to be faithful to, well, we could say the cultural mandate and to be fruitful and multiply, regardless of whether you think you're going to be good or not at something. That's just irrelevant. That's irrelevant. And so, and then of course, what I wrote about in that article is, and this is for people who can have children. Obviously, we're talking about people who are intentionally not having children, not people who cannot have children or who have extreme circumstances. We can get to that in a bit. But the other thing that is, when you have children and start raising a family, I don't know that there is any other thing quite so sanctifying to one's character than engaging in the raising of children. So as Christians, especially, when you think about what does it take? What kinds of things, life things, really bring us into a process, a greater, deeper process of moral development and sanctification of our character? I mean, it's hard to say there's anything other than maybe going into some kind of very strict religious life than raising children.
Yeah, and I think people on the other side tend to see the longing to have kids as being selfish. But I think that's not the case. God has put that longing in us that we'll pursue that which is good. And Tony, you said it so well. I think it's an attack on the very mandate that God established: multiply and flourish. And I think if we're going to question, did God really say that? We will end up listening to the snake and attack the seed of the woman.
Yeah, so it's exactly, and because one of the things that we learn from this is God's position and understanding toward us. When you have children, you understand how you could love your child and still be completely disappointed in maybe the naughty things that they've done, the way that someone that you is different than you, how their will would be different than yours. I mean, you learn so much about your relationship with God by your children's relationship with you. It's one of those teaching aspects that God has built into nature, and that's one of the reasons why I think the enemy likes to attack it, because today children are viewed as an accessory. They're like a Shih Tzu dog or something like that you put a pearl.
Well, and that's the point of the woman in Texas that you mentioned, and then again, we'll link to this 99 days video, where because the idea there is that there's not intrinsic value to the severely deformed or disabled child. The child is defective in the way a product you might order over Amazon is defective. So send it back. Now look, that's the natural human instinct. There we can go back to the ancients and say, yeah, defective child, get rid of it. Right? They were very practical in that sense. The Romans would have had no problem with saying this child's defective, abandon it. It's not going to be useful to me as an inheritor of my property, estate, and wealth.
Yeah, infanticide was universal. Actually, all cultures pretty much.
And adding to what you were saying, Lenny, it really helps us to understand who God is. God is understood in familial ways. That's how he has revealed himself to be. At the same time, it's no secret and it's no surprise that people, when they have children, they tend to be more conservative. They then want to conserve and they want to carry on some traditions, and they want to pass on history to future generation. And I think by not having children, we're going to lose all these valuable things.
Jacob, that's interesting. There's a relation there between, I think, people of a sort of progressive anti-natalist mindset. They're progressives first, and the relationship to history. I mean, Thomas Sowell brings this out quite well in his book, A Conflict of Visions, where he contrasts the progressive, or what he calls the unconstrained view of man, with the conservative or constrained view of man. The relationship to history is very different between the progressive and the vision and the conservative vision, where the conservative vision is always looking back to learn, to pass on, to cultivate, to be a custodian of all that has come before us. What, even in politics, like what Chesterton said, the only true democracy is tradition, includes tradition, because it's the democracy of the dead as well as the living. And the progressive mind, which is going to be the mindset that leads to an anti-natalist view, just, if anything, I mean, maybe at best they don't care about history usually, or if they look at history, they think it's just all darkness, it's all cruel, there's nothing valuable worth retaining, right? And that's the whole Marxist deconstructionist mindset, that everything that exists deserves to die. So I do think those two things are related, because there's nothing worth passing on, right? There's nothing worth passing on. So why should I have any children to pass it on to? There's nothing there, right?
And we got to be realistic as well. I think when we talk about the history and the tradition, it's a tradition of works. If we look at the past history, family unit was established on the basis of work. Work provided meaning and purpose, and the whole framework is changing now. The work looks different now, and the roles look different. So as Christians, we are not unaware of those realities. But in the midst of that, all because that's the case, we should not be losing that which is valuable, that which has created who we are. And we got to be optimistic about future and redeem that which is good, and build a society where everyone involves not only in terms of their own individual involvement and what they bring, but also contribute towards who they bring out in future, in terms of future generations.
Yeah, and with regards to this issue of women in the workplace and how difficult it is to balance a successful career and having children, I would just point to Amy Coney Barrett and be like, come on, like.
Well, and here's the actual thing. The whole you've heard the stats about women making 70 cents on the dollar, 77 cents on the dollar for every dollar the man makes, things like that. Those disparities are simply due to actual choices that women make as to whether they want to stay home with their kids or work the extra hours. What the actual differentiation is when again, given the choice after they've had a family, women tend to not want to go back to work. It changes them. They understand the relationship at a deeper level when the children are there, and they realize that they aren't fulfilled at all at work, that they are fulfilled by rearing these kids, by being with these kids. It changes them. And that's why when I read these millennials, I'm so scared, because what they're doing is they're believing actually the propaganda of the other side. And they've never even, and the problem is they're hearing it through an echo chamber. One of the striking things about the Guardian article was how many books she quoted and read that were all from the exact same point of view.
That's
all of them,
with maybe the one exception. But let me quote on that, because the other thing that was clear in the Guardian or the Vox article, Cohen's article, is like, what you're looking at is what you're going to believe. I mean, she's looking at one, which is interesting, because she ends the article saying, and I quote, that she wants to seek out a wider range of voices from people of all races, cultures, and economic strata, which will help ensure that we understand the real diversity of motherhood experiences people share, end quote. But if you read the rest of the article, that's what she concludes with. If you read the rest of the article, there's one demographic she doesn't want to read anything from. And that's the traditional Judeo-Christian perspective. I guarantee you she's not interested in that at all. So the wider range she's talking about is not really a wider range. It's a wider range of maybe superficial things like skin color or economic status, but it's not a wider range of worldview. It's not. Well, I would hope that maybe she would, start looking at something that John Paul II maybe wrote on the, like Consortium on the Family. But I doubt she's going to anytime soon. And then when you go earlier in the article, when she talks about the types of things she does read, it's very clear it's propaganda. You're looking at one just set of propaganda, and it's homogenous. It's not diverse at all. And she says here, quote, for at least the last decade, women of my age have absorbed cultural messaging that motherhood is thankless and depleting, straining careers, health and friendships, and destroying sex lives, end quote. Well, there you go. That's what you're looking at. Is that any of that true? So
part of this actually is part of what I call the feedback loop, because what has happened is in our modern media, we want to extol motherhood. We say, oh, motherhood's such a tough job, right? And so in your television series, first of all, the father's always the dolt. He's always the one that's useless and can't think straight. Mom is the only one that has everything together. She's doing everything. And you get the working mother film and, sweating it out and trying to do everything. And you hear all the people saying, you're trying to do it all and you shouldn't be having to do all that and struggle. And you hear all of this noise. And so it gets regurgitated back to them as, of course, but they never say, well, maybe it's the job that I should get rid of. They never pull that out. Yeah,
they're fine with her going out and working for another man.
Yeah, unless you're a faculty or staff at Harvard, Penn, and what was the other, MIT?
MIT, yeah.
Although the Penn president is now gone. Hopefully the Harvard one will soon follow, but it's another story. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's, it is kind of like, do we really want to look at a wider range of voices or not? You're in a propaganda loop. You're in, like you said, the feedback loop. She did. I mean, in that Cohen's article in the Vox, she cited, dozens and dozens of books and articles and movements and, that she had read. But, the sense is she's only reading one type of author at the end of the day. Just to refer back to somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, this conservative Supreme Court justice, incredibly accomplished lawyer and judge. I think she raised 6 kids, something like that. A couple of them were adopted. One of the things that struck me is in the Cohen article as well is she cites this author Bennett, who's older woman who apparently did something like the same thing. She was successfully sort of juggled motherhood and a career, right? But then she says this is this woman Bennett's, who she quotes. She says, "This remains true 15 years later." And this is Bennett's speaking, this successful author and mother. She says, "My entire friend group, we all raised great kids, but we were not writing about that because we don't want to be insufferable." Bennett, end quote, Bennett, she told me. "If we say anything about it, people hate you. And I understand that. There are cultural taboos against talking too much about it and huge penalties for women bragging about anything," end quote. And what this older woman who is successful both as a mother and as a career woman was saying is, if I write about how well things turned out with my kids, other women are going to get basically angry with me because they're jealous. So this would be another thing. It's like C.S. Lewis talks about what did he say at the end? Not the jealous people, but the bitter people don't get to win at the end of the story. The bitter, the envious, the jealous, they're not the ones who get to win. They're not the ones who get to dictate the story, God's story at the end, right? And this is kind of like allowing the bitter, the depressed, the envious to dictate, what you should do with your life. And this kind of goes back to one of the points you made, Jacob. It's what would you call it? The depressive realists. Not only are they sort of like there, but they're sort of like telling everybody else what they get to do, you know?
I put it this way: we need to actually teach our culture to sympathize with the depressive and empathize with joy. I think that's because we've reversed that. We're empathizing with the depressive, and in so doing, we're capitulating to the pressures and giving into, even the church is doing that. Whereas we need to turn that around and focus that back. As a Christian, I would say focus it back to Christ and empathize with all that which brings joy. And one of which things that brings joy is childbearing, taking care of your kids, future generation, and being focused onto a future and leaving a heritage and an inheritance. And even children are inheritance. That's what the scripture tells us, right?
I think if and probably to close our discussion on this kind of concept, what do we do specifically with the church? How do we inform these kids? One of the great things to do would be to have your kids come with you and go to maybe a senior center where you can actually start to learn who these people are as you serve them. And what you find is, as you serve, you develop relationships. And as you develop relationships, you can find meaning and joy in that. And then having kids isn't nearly as scary because you understand that with commitment and with service comes relationship and love. And it's just, we're out of practice. We're out of practice even within the family. Everybody's got their screen in front of them instead of having family dinner. So we're out of practice, and we need to develop relationships, teach our children how to develop relationships, why it's inherently a good thing to know other people. And we have to do that through certain, this is how the early church did it. They served others. And that's how they learned to love one another, right? You will know you are my disciples because you love one another.
Well, and Lenny, you brought up technology, and technology is always going to be a calculus in this equation because how it affects us. I mean, a lot has been written about that in recent decades, but we know that technology is also a player in this game, and it does affect. It has effect, and we're lamenting how it affects our interpersonal relationships. Screens take us away from the actual thing. They give us entertainment, gives us dopamine rushes that we may or may not get with real people, because real people are also going to, what it was like. Well, talk about that. I mean, go back to this idea of real people getting in the way and not letting the depressive realists run the show. It reminds me of Sartre's the final line of Sartre's play No Exit. Hell is other people. And that, like that's a real potential, like, world that we're living. I mean, maybe in the actual world, like, where more and more people just really start to think that what is hellish. And of course, Lewis has the great example of this image of this in the Great Town in the Great Divorce, that hell is really kind of being around other people. And could we really develop into a culture where the majority of us just don't want to be around other people? And that's a terrifying dystopian thought, but it seems possible. It seems like we're on the brink of something like that. So I would say that one way to combat that is to get married, to have some kids. Get married, to have some kids if you're in the church, and raise them in fear of the Lord, and don't make decisions based on your capacities, whether or not you think you'll be a good parent or not. Don't make them based on anxiety or fear over just merely potential things like maybe the climate could get bad or there's evil in the world. Well, there always has been, right? Those are just not good reasons to not become a parent and be a parent if you can, right? And then I think also too, we got to take into account the great advantage of having children to our character. There was a great There's a little proverb, might have been a real story about this uh, convert to Christianity in India in the 19th century. And I linked to the article on that, where the point of the story, the moral at the end of the story, is he goes off in this middle of this massive winter storm in the Himalayas to save another traveler who has fallen and broken his leg. And the Buddhist monk that he was walking with instead tries to go straight to the monastery because they think they're both going to die. So the Christian guy, who's a real guy, goes off and throws the guy who's broken his leg and who's about to die in the snowstorm on his shoulders, and hauls him all the way to the monastery. And just as he's about to get to the monastery, he trips over something, and it's the body of the frozen monk. The monk has died. And the idea is that the carrying of the other person kept his body temperature up, through the exertion, which gave him the actual ability to survive the cold and get to the monastery. And then the moral of the story is, when asked then by a disciple, what is the greatest evil in the world? And his response was, to have no burden to bear is the greatest evil.
And Tony, I will also add that, just while we got to learn from our children much, at the same time, there is a need for parents to take the responsibility of teaching their children what it means to be a parent. I think that's so much needed. Our children need to see that, and that will be a motivation for them.
Yeah, that was so one side point. In both of these articles, it almost felt like What, you don't have mothers to come and help you? I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know if I'm going to have this motherhood. You've got, this is what families would do. They would come in, they would show you. And guess what? Just like baseball or your job, you get better at it as you do it. If you don't do it, of course you're never going to get better at it. But you can't say, well, I can't start a career because I don't know if I'd be any good at it. Nobody thinks like that. Well, this is a career. This is actually a life skill that you develop as you go along. And every parent will tell you that. Every parent will tell you that they've made mistakes.
And Cohen even
But
makes that point in the article that when you just start doing the thing, you change, right? She says, good quote, good parenting is possible for anyone who's willing to learn. So yeah, so she even makes that point. It's like, but I
so
tell
yeah,
you, that is
I feel
something
like her.
I've encountered in the church. That's the reason I've heard that before.
I feel like her parents, she just doesn't have a strong relationship with her own parents in order to be feeling like she's got to stick it out there and do it all on her own. I don't get where they're coming from on these.
Yeah, I don't know. But I said, like, the and you know, I'm not trying to, obviously I won't mention him, but I've met a handful of people who've given it, you know, maybe this would be another podcast, like maybe another podcast we could do is, are there good reasons? Are there any good reasons not to have children? If you, you know, assuming you can, you want to go into a missionary field in the middle of Afghanistan, so, some contexts, maybe you can have children, but you yourself have a very severe, some other kind of very severe physical issue, or extreme poverty. So there may be mitigating factors, and we can maybe do another recording on that. But assuming, a relatively normal situation, and you are a married Christian couple, um, you know, I think there are very few good good reasons, if any, to not at least try to have children. Yeah.
There is one good reason to, and there's one good reason for
Well,
sure,
right.
is
Yeah.
that
Yes.
if you're not getting married,
And it
don't have
is
children.
noticeable that both of the authors of these articles talk about their, they talk about their partners. These are just boyfriends. One does wonder what these men are up to. They don't seem to have much of a voice at all in this in their.
They're taught that as well. It's a woman's body, woman's choice, and but I'm not going to assume that. I am a little cautious in understanding sometimes people use the language partner to be quote inclusive unquote, whether they're married or not. They
That's
just use
true.
that phrase.
It could be a married partner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, gentlemen, this has been a good discussion. We'll link to the articles. They are very interesting articles, and I think we all have agreed. And I was talking to one young guy at Biola yesterday who was writing a paper on theology of family, marriage and family, that this is one area where evangelicals especially feel we're lagging a little bit behind in developing a positive and constructive vision for family, And I would say, like, the first thing to think about is having a child is about as close as you can come to creating a universe. I mean, if God created the universe ex nihilo, about the closest thing we could come to participating using that communicable attribute of creativity is creating another human being. And I think at the end of the day, what's really been lost here is we don't understand what we're actually creating when we produce a child. And that's probably the central problem. So, all right, gentlemen, we'll do it again soon. It's good seeing you.
All right.
All right. God
Thanks
bless.
so much.
Yeah.